The torch flames danced wildly in the night wind, casting long shadows across Miriam Harper's face as she clutched her 6-year-old daughter to her chest. 6 men on horseback surrounded her crumbling front porch, their faces twisted with anger and righteous judgment. The horses snorted and stamped in the darkness, sensing the tension that hung thick in the air. "You poisoned your husband, witch," Tom Garrett shouted from his saddle, his voice carrying across the empty land. "That child deserves better than a murderer for a mother." Miriam's whole body trembled as she held Sarah tighter. The little girl buried her face in her mother's worn dress, her small shoulders shaking with terrified sobs. Miriam's voice broke as desperation overtook her pride. She fell to her knees in the dirt, still holding her daughter close. "Please," she begged, tears streaming down her hollow cheeks. "Please don't take my child. She's all I have. I didn't. I swear to God I didn't." "The law's the law, Mrs. Harper," Sheriff Watson said coldly as he dismounted from his horse. His boots hit the ground with a heavy thud that seemed to echo in the silence. "Little Sarah's going to the orphanage in Silver Ridge. It's already been decided by the town council. There's nothing more to discuss." Sarah's terrified screams pierced the night as rough hands reached toward her. The child clung to her mother with all her strength, her cries cutting through the darkness like a knife. Miriam wrapped her arms around her daughter, refusing to let go even as the men moved closer. Then a single rifle shot cracked through the air. Everyone froze. The horses reared and whinnied. The men's hands stopped mid-reach. Even Sarah's screams quieted to frightened whimpers. The sound of the gunshot still echoed across the empty prairie. From the darkness beyond the circle of torchlight, a figure on horseback emerged. He moved slowly, deliberately, his horse's hooves crunching against the dry earth. The rider sat tall in his saddle, silent and still as stone. His rifle pointed at the sky, but his eyes, cold and steady, promised violence if necessary. "No one," the man said quietly, his voice like gravel and iron, "is taking that child." Sheriff Watson's hand moved toward his own gun, but something in the stranger's eyes made him pause. "This is none of your concern, Rollins. We're acting within the law here." The man called Rollins kept his rifle ready, his gaze never wavering. "Then the law needs fixing. But how did it come to this? How did a poor widow end up on her knees begging for her child's life? And who was this silent rancher willing to stand against 6 armed men?" The answer began 3 months earlier, on a day when the sun burned so hot it seemed to melt the very air itself. Eli Rollins squinted against the blazing sun as his horse carried him along the dusty trail toward Dry Creek. The heat pressed down on everything like a heavy weight, making even breathing feel like work. Red dust kicked up from his horse's hooves and clung to his worn clothes, his weathered face, and the sweat on his skin. He'd been riding since dawn from his ranch 40 miles north, and every muscle in his body ached. All this distance for a few sacks of barley. The thought made him shake his head. The drought had hit harder this year than most, turning green fields into cracked earth and drying up streams that usually ran year-round. His horses needed feed if they were going to survive the season, and he'd run through his own supplies weeks ago. Town was the last place Eli wanted to be. He preferred the quiet of his ranch, the company of his animals, the solitude that let him forget the family he'd lost years ago. But necessity had a way of making decisions for a man. Dry Creek finally appeared on the horizon, rising from the desert like a collection of tired, sun-bleached bones. The false-fronted buildings leaned under the weight of years and heat, their paint peeling away in long strips. Faded signs creaked in the hot wind. A few horses stood tied to hitching posts with their heads hung low, too exhausted by the heat to do anything but stand and suffer. The whole town smelled of dust, sweat, and sour whiskey drifting out from the saloon. Eli swung down from his horse in front of Morrison's general store and tied the reins to the post. He patted his horse's hot neck and murmured, Won't be long, boy. The animal's only response was a tired snort. Inside the store, the air was cooler but heavy and still. Wooden shelves sagged under the weight of bolts of cloth, jars of beans, boxes of ammunition, and rusted tools. The floorboards creaked under Eli's boots as he walked toward the counter. Chester Morrison, the storekeeper, was talking loudly to two ranchers, his chest puffed up with self-importance. "I told her last week, no more credit," Morrison said, loud enough for the whole store to hear. "A woman's got to learn to manage better. That Miriam Harper's always been trouble, if you ask me." Tom Garrett sneered from where he leaned against a barrel. "Trouble before her husband died, and worse after. Some women just attract misfortune, I suppose. Or cause it," another man added with a dark chuckle. Eli said nothing. He learned long ago that small towns ran on gossip like horses ran on oats, and getting involved in other people's business was a quick way to make enemies. He kept his face neutral and stepped forward to the counter. "Afternoon," Eli said, his voice low and even. "I'll take 3 sacks of barley." Morrison looked up, and his expression shifted into a merchant's practiced smile. "Eli Rollins, haven't seen you in town for months. 3 sacks, you said? That'll be $12. Eli laid down the bills on the scarred wooden counter. Morrison reached for them, but before his fingers could close around the money, the bell above the door rang out sharp and clear. The conversation died instantly. Every head in the store turned toward the door. The air itself seemed to grow heavier, pressing down with judgment and hostility. A woman stepped inside, and Eli felt the shift in the room like a physical thing. She was younger than he'd expected from the men's talk, maybe 25, with dark hair pulled back in a simple knot. She wore a faded calico dress that had been mended more than once, the stitches careful but obvious. Her boots were worn nearly through at the soles, but despite her poverty, she held her back straight and her chin lifted with a dignity that dared the room to break her. Through the front window, Eli could see a small girl waiting outside, dark-haired like her mother, standing perfectly still with old, watchful eyes. "Mr. Morrison," the woman said softly but clearly, "I need flour, salt, and a tin of lard." Morrison's face hardened like cooling iron. "Cash up front, Mrs. Harper. You know my policy." Mrs. Harper. So this was the widow they'd been talking about. Eli watched as she opened a small, threadbare purse and placed coins on the counter. Even for where he stood, Eli could see it wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. Morrison counted the coins slowly, deliberately, dragging out her shame for everyone to witness. He pushed them around with one finger, making a show of adding them up. Finally, he looked up with a cruel smile. "This will cover half the flour," he said, his voice thick with satisfaction. "No salt, no lard." Miriam Harper's hands trembled slightly, but her voice stayed steady. "Then I'll take what it covers." Tom Garrett pushed off from the barrel with a nasty smirk. "Maybe you should consider other ways of earning money, Mrs. Harper. A widow's got to make her way somehow, after all." The suggestion in his voice was clear and ugly. Eli watched as fire flashed in Miriam Harper's dark eyes. She turned on Garrett like a woman who'd taken too many insults to let another one pass. "I manage honestly, Mr. Garrett," she said sharply, which is more than some people in this town can say. "Honest women don't poison their husbands," the other rancher muttered, just loud enough to be heard throughout the store. The words fell like a stone into still water. Miriam's face went pale, all the blood draining from her cheeks. But she didn't back down. She didn't run. She stood her ground and turned back to Morrison. "My flour, Mr. Morrison," she said quietly. Morrison leaned forward across the counter, cruelty curling at the corners of his mouth like smoke. "Prices have gone up, Mrs. Harper. Especially for your kind. Those coins might buy you a cup of flour, if that." Something tightened in Eli's chest. He'd spent years minding his own business, keeping his head down, staying out of other people's troubles. He'd lost too much already to risk getting involved in a town's petty cruelties. But standing there, watching this woman trying to buy food for her child while men mocked her pain. Something in him refused to stay silent. Eli's jaw tightened. Before he could talk himself out of it, he stepped forward and laid $2 silver on the counter beside her coins. The metallic clink of the coins seemed loud in the silent store. "Add what the lady needs to my order," Eli said calmly, his eyes fixed on Morrison's face. The room froze. Every person in the store stared at him like he'd just grown a second head. Miriam Harper turned to face him, and up close, Eli could see the hollow places in her cheeks where hunger had carved away at her. He saw the careful patches in her dress, the worn leather of her boots, the exhaustion in her eyes that no amount of sleep could fix. But more than that, he saw pride warring with desperation, dignity fighting against need. "I can't accept charity," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly on the last word. "You're not accepting charity," Eli said, keeping his tone matter-of-fact. He never took his eyes off Morrison's reddening face. "Morrison's store made an error in my favor last time I was here. Overcharged me for supplies. This squares us up. Isn't that right, Morrison?" The storekeeper's face flushed deep red, but he wasn't fool enough to challenge Eli's steady gaze or call him a liar in front of witnesses. After a long, tense moment, he nodded once, his lips pressed into a thin, angry line. Miriam's voice shook, but she held it steady through sheer force of will. "Flour, salt, lard, and a small bag of sugar." She paused, then added quietly, "For my daughter." "Whatever she needs," Eli said simply. Then he turned away, giving her the dignity of not watching as Morrison filled her order with barely controlled rage. He could feel the weight of every man's stare pressing against his back like physical things. He'd marked himself now. He'd stood with the town's outcast, the woman they'd all decided was a murderer and worse. Whatever consequences came from that choice would be his to bear. When Miriam's packages were wrapped and ready, she paused beside him. For a moment, she just stood there, and Eli could feel her searching his face for the hidden price that usually followed acts of kindness. Men didn't help women like her without expecting something in return. He could see that belief written in every line of her careful expression. "Thank you," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll repay you somehow. I promise." "No need, ma'am," Eli replied, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture his mother had taught him a lifetime ago. She held his gaze for another heartbeat, still looking for the trap, still waiting for the other shoe to drop. Finding nothing but honest concern in his weathered face, she gathered her packages and left the store with her head held high, her spine straight despite the weight of judgment that pressed down on her from every corner of the room. Eli watched through the window as she walked down the dusty street. Her small frame was burdened not just by the parcels in her arms, but by something far heavier, the crushing weight of a town's condemnation, of being judged and found guilty without trial, of fighting every single day just to survive. "You've made a mistake, Rollins," Morrison muttered as he finally counted out Eli's barley. "That woman is nothing but trouble. Mark my words, you'll regret this." Eli picked up his sacks of grain without answering. But at the door, he paused and looked back at the men in the store. "Seems to me," he said quietly, "a woman trying to feed her child isn't the one making trouble here." Outside, the sun was beginning its slow drop toward the horizon, turning the sky shades of orange and red like fire. Eli loaded his supplies onto his horse and mounted up, ready to head north to his ranch and the solitude he preferred. But his eyes followed Miriam Harper's figure until she disappeared into the poorer part of town, where the houses leaned and the streets turned to mud when it rained. He told himself it didn't matter. He told himself he'd only come to town for grain, nothing more. He'd done a good deed, and that was the end of it. Tomorrow he'd be back at his ranch, and Miriam Harper would be someone else's concern. But as Eli rode out of Dry Creek, her fire stayed with him. Her pride in the face of cruelty. The dignity she wore like armor even as her hands trembled. The way she'd looked at her daughter through that window, with a love so fierce it could burn down the world. He'd crossed a line that day in Morrison's store, though he didn't yet understand just how much it would change his life. He didn't know that 3 days later, he'd find himself turning back toward that widow's broken farmhouse. He didn't know that a small girl's solemn eyes would haunt his dreams. He didn't know that he was about to stop running from life and start fighting for it again. All he knew, as the sun set behind him and the desert stretched out ahead, was that something had shifted, something he couldn't ride away from anymore. And whether he liked it or not, his solitary life was about to end. 3 days passed, but Eli couldn't forget her. He worked his ranch from sunrise to sunset, mending fences and tending horses, trying to lose himself in the familiar rhythm of physical labor. But every time he paused to wipe the sweat from his face, he saw Miriam Harper's hollow cheeks. Every time the wind kicked up dust, he remembered the way she'd walk down that street carrying her shame like a cross. And worst of all, he kept seeing that little girl through the window, dark-haired and solemn, watching the world with eyes too old for a 6-year-old child. He told himself it wasn't his concern. He'd done his good deed. He'd helped when no one else would. And that was enough. A man couldn't fix every broken thing in the world, especially not a man who'd already lost everything that mattered to him once before. But on the morning of the 4th day, Eli found himself in his barn, staring at sacks of seed corn he'd saved from last season. Good seed that he didn't really need, sitting there going to waste. Before he could talk himself out of it, he loaded a sack onto his horse. Just extra supplies, he muttered to himself as he swung into the saddle. Would go to waste otherwise. The lie tasted bitter even as he said it. The Harper place was worse than he'd imagined. When it finally came into view, Eli had to stop his horse and just stare. The homestead looked like it was barely holding itself together through pure stubbornness. The roof was patched with mismatched boards and pieces of tin that caught the sunlight. Half the fence had fallen over, the posts rotted through. What should have been a garden was nothing but cracked earth, dead as bone. In the yard stood the little girl. She didn't run or hide when she saw him coming. She didn't smile or wave like a normal child might. She just stood there in a faded dress, watching him with that same solemn expression he'd seen through the store window. Her dark hair hung in 2 careful braids, and her face was thin with hunger. But it was her eyes that struck him most, wary and watchful, carrying a wariness that no 6-year-old should know. Eli touched his hat to her as he dismounted. "Morning, miss." She didn't answer, just kept watching him like she was trying to decide if he was dangerous. Before Eli could knock on the door, it creaked open. Miriam Harper stood there with a kitchen knife gripped in her hand, held low but ready. She looked like a woman who'd fought too many battles and was prepared to fight another. Her eyes were hard, her jaw set, but when she recognized him, something flickered across her face. Surprise, maybe relief, quickly hidden behind suspicion. "Mr. Rollins," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Eli," he corrected. "I brought some seed corn. Thought it might help you get a garden started." Her eyes narrowed. Thought maybe the poor widow could use more charity? Thought maybe someone trying to keep a garden alive in a drought could use seed that's just sitting useless in my barn. He replied evenly, meeting her gaze without flinching. They stood there facing each other, neither willing to back down. Miriam's grip on the knife stayed firm. Eli kept his hands visible and non-threatening. The moment stretched out between them, heavy with everything unsaid. Her fear, his sincerity, the risk they were both taking just by having this conversation. Finally, Miriam's shoulders dropped slightly. She lowered the knife with a long sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the whole world. "I suppose you'd better come in," she said quietly. Inside, the house was sparse but clean. 3 mismatched chairs sat around a scarred wooden table. A small wood stove held a single pot. Shelves on the wall held barely more than the supplies he'd seen her buy. The flour, salt, and lard stretched to last as long as possible. Everything in the room spoke of poverty held back only by fierce dignity and endless determination. "Sarah," Miriam called, and the little girl entered, moving close to her mother's skirts like a small shadow. She curtsied politely. Someone had taught her manners, but her eyes never left Eli's face. "Would you like some water, Mr. Rollins?" Miriam asked. Eli could hear what it cost her to offer even that small thing. "I'm fine, thank you," he said gently. "I only came to drop off the seed and share a few tricks about planting it right in drought soil. Won't take long." Miriam studied him for a long moment, searching his face again for hidden motives. Whatever she saw, or didn't see, made her nod slowly. "Show me then," she said. For the next 2 hours, they worked side by side in what was left of her garden. Eli showed her how to plant deep, how to shape the soil to catch and hold what little rain might come, how to water at dawn and dusk to keep the moisture from evaporating in the brutal heat. Miriam watched carefully and followed his instructions, her hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the blisters he could see forming on her palms. She never complained, never asked to rest, just worked with grim determination. Sarah followed them around the garden, carrying seeds in her small apron. She hardly spoke, but her wide eyes tracked Eli's every movement. Once, when he looked up, he caught her staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Part curiosity, part longing, part fear. When the sun started dropping toward the horizon, Eli called a halt. He noticed the way Miriam swayed slightly when she stood, the way exhaustion pulled at her thin frame. He'd seen how hunger had carved away at both mother and daughter, leaving them sharp-edged and fragile. "That's enough for today," he said, brushing dirt from his hands. "Seeds need time to settle before the next watering." Miriam wiped her forehead with a dirty sleeve, leaving a smudge of earth across her face. "I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Rollins." "No thanks needed," Eli said. "Just neighbors helping neighbors." She laughed, but it was a bitter sound with no joy in it. "Neighbors? You're the only man in this whole town willing to be seen anywhere near here." Eli had no answer to that truth. He just gathered his tools and headed for his horse, ready to mount up and ride back to his solitary life. But as he swung into the saddle, Sarah stepped forward. Her small face was solemn and serious, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet but steady. "Mr. Cowboy," she said. Eli looked down at her. "Yes, miss. Are you a good man or a bad man?" "Sarah." Miriam's voice was sharp with embarrassment, but Eli held up a hand. He'd been asked many questions in his life, but somehow this one, from a 6-year-old girl who'd seen too much ugliness, struck deeper than any other. He thought about it for a moment, then slowly climbed back down from his saddle. He knelt in the dust so he could look her straight in the eyes. "I try to be good," he said honestly. "Don't always succeed." "Why do you ask?" Sarah's voice stayed quiet but clear. "Mama says good men don't hurt little girls. But the men in town say bad things to Mama, and they're supposed to be good men. So how do you know who's really good?" The words hit Eli like a punch to the chest. He glanced up at Miriam and saw shame and pain written across her face. Shame that her daughter had to ask such questions, pain that she couldn't protect her from the world's cruelty. "Sometimes people get confused about what's good and what's bad," Eli said carefully. "They listen to gossip instead of looking at the truth. But I want you to know something, Sarah. Your mama is a good woman, one of the best I've met. Don't let anyone tell you different." Sarah's solemn expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes, a tiny spark of hope, maybe, or relief. Then, without warning, she threw her thin arms around his neck. The hug lasted only a moment before she pulled back and ran to her mother's side. But that brief embrace stayed with Eli long after he'd mounted his horse and turned toward home. As he rode away, the sun painting the sky in shades of gold and red, Eli knew he was lying to himself. This wasn't just about wasted seed or being neighborly. Something about that woman's fierce dignity and that child's old eyes had gotten under his skin in a way he couldn't explain and didn't want to examine too closely. That night, storm clouds rolled in from the west. Eli lay in his bed at the ranch, listening to distant thunder rumble across the prairie. Rain began to hammer against his roof, and lightning cracked the sky open with brilliant white light. He tried to sleep, but each crash of thunder dragged his thoughts back to Miriam and Sarah in that crumbling house. Were they dry? Were they safe? That roof looked like it could barely hold back a strong wind, let alone a real storm. He told himself it wasn't his problem. They'd survived before he came along, and they'd survive now. He'd done more than most men would have done. He'd crossed lines already just by helping them. Getting more involved would only bring trouble down on all their heads. But when another roar of thunder shook his windows, followed by a flash of lightning that lit up his entire bedroom, Eli gave up pretending. He threw off his blankets, pulled on his boots and coat, and headed for the barn. His horse protested being saddled in the middle of the storm, but Eli was determined. He swung into the saddle and turned the animal's head toward the eastern edge of Dry Creek, toward a broken farmhouse and two people who'd somehow become his responsibility without him meaning for it to happen. The ride was brutal. Rain turned the trail to mud that sucked at his horse's hooves. Water streamed down Eli's face, blinding him. Lightning split the sky, so close he could smell the electricity in the air. But he pushed forward through the storm, driven by something he couldn't name and wouldn't have admitted even if he could. When the Harper house finally appeared in a flash of lightning, Eli's heart dropped. Even from a distance, he could see that something was wrong. And then he heard it, cutting through the thunder and rain, a child's terrified screaming. Eli pushed his horse harder, mud spraying up from the animal's hooves. As he got closer, he could see water pouring through holes in the roof like waterfalls. The front door hung open, banging in the wind. Sarah's screams grew louder, more desperate. He didn't bother tying his horse. He just jumped down and ran for the house, his boots splashing through puddles that were already ankle-deep. Inside was chaos. Water poured in from at least a dozen places where the roof had given way. The floor was slick with mud and rain. Buckets and pots were scattered everywhere, useless against the flood pouring down. Miriam stood in the middle of it all, trying to catch the leaks with whatever she could find. Her hair hung in wet ropes down her back. Her dress was soaked through. She moved frantically from one leak to another, but for every one she caught, two more appeared. She was fighting a battle she couldn't possibly win. "Let me help," Eli shouted over the roar of the storm. Miriam spun around, and for just a moment, relief flashed across her face before she masked it with pride again. "The roof's going," she shouted back. "I can't stop it." Even as she spoke, a horrible cracking sound came from above. A section of roof sagged dangerously, water pooling in the depression. It was going to collapse any second. "Get what you need," Eli ordered, his voice cutting through her panic. "We're moving to the barn. Now." For once, Miriam didn't argue. She grabbed a sack and started shoving clothes into it. Sarah's things first, then hers. She swept the precious supplies from the shelf into her apron. Meanwhile, Eli scooped Sarah up into his arms. The little girl was hysterical, her whole body shaking with sobs. She clung to him like he was the only solid thing in a world falling apart, her small arms wrapped tight around his neck. "It's okay, sweetheart," Eli murmured into her wet hair. "I've got you. You're safe now." They stumbled through the rain toward the barn, Sarah buried against Eli's chest, Miriam clutching her sack of belongings. Behind them, they heard a tremendous crash as another section of roof gave way. Miriam let out a choke sob, but kept moving forward. The barn was dark, but blessedly dry. Rain drummed on the roof above them, but it held firm. Eli set Sarah down gently and immediately went to work. He moved hay bales to block the wind coming through the gaps in the walls. He found an old metal bucket and built a small fire inside it, just enough to give them warmth and light. He spread out the driest horse blankets he could find, creating a makeshift bed. Then he took off his own coat, still relatively dry on the inside, and wrapped it around Miriam and Sarah together. "You'll freeze," Miriam protested weakly, but there was no strength behind the words. I'll manage, Eli said firmly. That child won't. Neither will you. They huddled together near the small fire while the storm raged outside. Sarah's terrified sobs gradually quieted to hiccups, then to exhausted whimpers, and finally to silence as sleep overtook her. Miriam held her daughter close, her own hand still trembling, whether from cold or shock or both. Eli couldn't tell. For a long time, nobody spoke. They just sat there listening to the rain, to the thunder rolling across the prairie, to Sarah's soft breathing. The firelight flickered across their faces, casting dancing shadows on the barn walls. Finally, Miriam spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper. It's gone, isn't it? The house. Eli wanted to lie, to offer false comfort, but she deserved the truth. Roof's half down, he admitted. Maybe more by morning. But the walls are still standing. It can be rebuilt. Miriam's laugh was bitter and broken. With what? I spent my last coins on that flower. We have nothing left. No money, no home, nothing. We'll figure something out, Eli said. She turned to look at him then, her eyes reflecting the firelight. There is no we, Mr. Rollins. This isn't your fight. You've already done more than anyone else would. But I can't ask you to. Eli, he interrupted quietly. And you're not asking. I'm offering. Why? The question came out broken, desperate. Why would you do this? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. Thunder rolled overhead, giving Eli time to think. He could give her easy answers, talk about being neighborly, about Christian duty, about doing the right thing. But sitting there in the firelight with this woman who'd lost everything and still held her chin high, with her daughter sleeping peacefully for the first time because she finally felt safe, easy answers weren't enough. Maybe not, he said slowly, his voice low and firm. But I'm making it mine. Her eyes filled with tears that had nothing to do with the rain. I don't understand. Some things are worth fighting for, Eli said, and he was surprised by how much he meant it. And I reckon you and that little girl are two of them. A tear slipped down Miriam's cheek. Then another. She tried to hold them back, tried to maintain the dignity she wore like armor, but it was too much. Everything, the storm, the destroyed house, the kindness of this man who kept showing up when she needed him most, it all crashed over her like the rain outside. I'm so tired of fighting, she whispered. I know, Eli said gently. So let me fight for you for a while. They sat in silence after that, but it was a different kind of silence. Softer, safer. Outside, the storm began to ease. The thunder moved off into the distance. The rain slowed from a roar to a steady patter. But inside the barn, something had fundamentally changed. A line had been crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. When dawn finally came, it broke clear and bright, as if the storm had never happened. But when they stepped outside the barn, the harsh light revealed the full extent of the damage. The Harper house stood with half its roof gone, exposing the interior to the sky. Water had warped the wooden walls. What little furniture they'd had was destroyed. The place couldn't survive another storm, might not even survive a strong wind. Miriam stood staring at the wreckage, Sarah pressed against her side. Her face was carefully blank, showing nothing. But Eli could see the way her shoulders trembled, the way she held herself together by pure force of will. You've done enough, she said quietly, not looking at him. Go back to your ranch before this ruins you too, before the whole town turns against you for helping us. Eli shook his head. I'll be back tomorrow with lumber and tools. We'll start fresh. Mr. Rollins. Eli, he corrected for what felt like the 100th time. And I don't walk away from people I've chosen to stand with. She turned to look at him then, really look at him. They'll make your life hell for this. Let them try, Eli said simply. And he meant it. Whatever came next, gossip, threats, violence, he'd face it. Because for the first time in years, since long before his own family had been taken from him, Eli Rollins had something worth fighting for again. True to his word, Eli returned the next morning with a wagon full of lumber, nails, and tools. Together, they worked side by side for days that turned into weeks. They tore down what couldn't be saved and built a new frame. Miriam worked with stubborn determination, her hands blistering but never stopping. Sarah carried nails and fetched water, proud of every small task. Slowly, the house took shape again. Each nail driven seemed to bind them closer. Eli found himself looking forward to the mornings when he'd ride up and see Sarah waiting in the yard, her face lighting up when she spotted him. He liked the way Miriam sometimes smiled without meaning to when he made a joke. He liked the comfortable silences on the porch in the evenings, sharing simple meals of beans and bread. But the town noticed, and the town didn't approve. One hot afternoon, 3 riders appeared at the gate. Sheriff Watson sat tall in his saddle, flanked by Tom Garrett and Pike Stevens. Their faces were dark with judgment. "Rollins," the sheriff called out. "Folks in town are talking. A single man spending his days at a widow's place. It ain't proper." Eli rested his hand on his hammer, close enough to where his gun belt hung on a post. "Seems to me fixing a roof after a storm is proper work, Sheriff." Tom Garrett spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "She poisoned her husband, Rollins. Everyone knows it. You're making a mistake standing with her." Miriam stepped forward then, and Eli saw fire flash in her eyes. Her dress was dusty, and her hands were scraped raw from work, but she stood tall and proud. "Everyone knows lies," she said sharply. "Not one person lifted a finger when that storm left my child with a leaking roof over her head. Mr. Rollins did. If that shames you gentlemen, then it's your shame to carry, not ours." The men shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. Pike Stevens looked away, but Garrett's face hardened with anger. "You'll drag him down with you, widow," Garrett sneered. "Mark my words." "Enough," Eli said coldly, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "If you come to work, pick up a hammer. If not, ride on." They left with muttered threats hanging in the air like smoke. The warning was clear. Trouble was coming. It came a week later when Eli rode into town for more supplies. 5 men were waiting for him outside Morrison's store, half drunk and spoiling for a fight. They surrounded him before he could get back to his horse. "The witch widow's protector," one of them shouted, shoving Eli hard. The first punch came fast, splitting his lip and filling his mouth with blood. The second doubled him over. But Eli had been in plenty of fights in his younger days. He came up swinging hard, putting 2 men flat on their backs before the others could grab him. "You've chosen your side, Rollins," Garrett spat as the sheriff's shotgun blast finally broke up the brawl. "This won't end well for you." Bruised and bleeding, Eli rode straight back to the Harper place. Miriam met him at the door, her face going pale at the sight of his swollen eye and split lip. "This is what I feared," she whispered, pulling him inside. Her hand shook as she cleaned his wounds with a wet cloth. "You're paying the price for standing with us. This is my fight now," Eli said steadily, despite the pain shooting through his ribs. Her hands paused. "Why, Eli? Why risk everything? Your reputation, your safety, your whole life, why?" He caught her hand gently and held it. "Because I won't stand by while you and Sarah are left alone to face this town's hate. Because when I look at you, I don't see trouble or scandal. I see a woman worth every risk. I see someone who deserves to be fought for." Tears slipped down her cheeks. "I don't want to hope," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Hope hurts too much when it's taken away." Eli reached up with his other hand and gently wiped her tears. "Hope anyway," he said softly. Their faces were close now, so close he could feel her breath. For a moment, the world narrowed to just the 2 of them, her dark eyes searching his, her hand trembling in his grip, the space between them charged with everything unspoken. He started to lean forward, and she didn't pull away. "Mama," Sarah's small voice came from the doorway, breaking the moment. They stepped apart quickly. Miriam wiped her eyes and turned to her daughter with a shaky smile. But something had shifted between them, something that couldn't be taken back. From that day forward, Eli spent more time at the Harper place than his own ranch. He brought food, fixed the remaining problems with the house, taught Sarah to ride on a gentle old pony. The girl blossomed under his attention, laughing more, playing like a child should. In the evenings, Eli and Miriam would sit on the porch steps while Sarah slept inside, talking quietly about everything and nothing. But danger still circled them like wolves around a campfire. One night, angry voices shattered the peace. Rocks crashed through the newly repaired windows. Sarah woke up screaming as men on horseback circled the house, jeering and shouting in the darkness. "Murderer," they yelled. "Witch, you'll burn in hell for what you did." Eli grabbed his rifle and fired 2 warning shots into the air. The riders scattered into the night, their laughter fading into the distance. But the message was clear: they would not be left in peace. The next morning, Eli made his decision. He found Miriam in the kitchen, trying to sweep up the broken glass while Sarah clung to her skirts. "Pack what you can carry," he said quietly. "You're both coming to my ranch. It's on higher ground, easier to defend. You'll be safer there." Miriam hesitated, pride warring with fear on her face. "Eli, I can't." "Please, Mama," Sarah's small voice interrupted. She looked up at her mother with frightened eyes. "I want to live where the bad men can't find us. Please." Miriam looked down at her daughter's terrified face, then back at Eli's steady presence. Slowly, she nodded. They packed what little they had: patched clothes, worn dishes, a few treasured possessions. As they loaded everything onto Eli's wagon and left the Harper house behind, Miriam didn't look back. That place held nothing but painful memories now. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Eli's ranch was everything the Harper place wasn't. Solid, well-built, sitting on high ground with clear views in all directions. That first night, Miriam stood on the porch with Sarah asleep inside, looking up at the wide sky, full of stars. "What are we doing, Eli?" she asked quietly. He took her hand, his rough palm warm against her fingers. "Building something new," he said, "if you'll let me." She looked at him for a long moment, fear and hope battling in her eyes. Then slowly, she nodded. 2 weeks of peace followed. Sarah thrived, helping with chores and laughing freely for the first time. Miriam cooked and mended and tended a small garden. In the evenings, they sat together like a real family. But Miriam still jumped at unexpected sounds, still waited for the other shoe to drop. One afternoon, Doc Hastings rode up to the ranch, his face grave. He was one of the few decent men left in Dry Creek. "I came to warn you," he said, dismounting heavily. "The town council met last night. They've drawn up legal papers claiming Miriam is an unfit mother. The sheriff has authorization to take Sarah to the orphanage in Silver Ridge. They're coming in 3 days." The words hit like a physical blow. Miriam went white, her hand flying to her mouth. Sarah, playing nearby, heard everything. Her face crumpled with fear. "They can't," Miriam whispered. "She's my daughter. She's all I have." "I testified on your behalf," Doc said sadly. "Told them you're a good mother. But they wouldn't listen." "I'm sorry, Miriam." After Doc left, Eli found Miriam in the barn, trying to muffle her sobs so Sarah wouldn't hear. He pulled her into his arms and let her cry against his chest. "We can't run," she said brokenly. "The law will follow us anywhere." "Then we don't run," Eli said firmly. "We prove your innocence. Someone in this town knows what really happened to Jacob. We find them, we get the truth." The next day, Eli rode alone into Dry Creek. He went straight to the saloon where Jacob Harper used to drink. The bartender, Old Pete, looked nervous when Eli walked in. Eli ordered whiskey and waited. He listened to the men around him talk. Finally, he asked Pete directly, what kind of man was Jacob Harper? Pete glanced around nervously. Drank too much. Owed money to the wrong people. Boo! Pete's eyes flicked to the corner where Tom Garrett sat watching. Gambling debts. Big ones. Week before he died, some men beat him badly. Thought they'd killed him then. The pieces started falling into place in Eli's mind. If Jacob died, his debts died with him. But if Miriam could be blamed and destroyed, the Harper land could be seized cheap. Garrett and his friends would profit handsomely. Eli found Dr. Carson next, the man who'd examined Jacob's body. The old doctor looked haunted. What really killed Jacob Harper? Eli asked. Carson's hand shook. His liver was destroyed from years of drinking. It was natural causes, pure and simple. But Morrison paid me to stay quiet. Said it was easier to blame the widow than admit we all looked the other way while Jacob drank himself to death. Will you testify to that? The doctor hesitated, then nodded. I've carried this guilt long enough. Yes, I'll testify. Eli gathered more witnesses. The store clerk who'd seen Jacob buy laudanum for himself. A farmer who'd watched Jacob self-medicating for pain. A pattern emerged of conspiracy, greed, and a town willing to destroy an innocent woman to cover their own sins. The night before the sheriff was due to arrive, Eli and Miriam sat together under the stars. Neither could sleep. If they take her tomorrow... Miriam's voice broke. Eli cupped her face in his hands. They won't. I promise you, Miriam. I promise. He kissed her then, a kiss full of desperation and promise and everything they hadn't said aloud. When they finally pulled apart, both had tears on their cheeks. I love you, Miriam whispered. I love you too, Eli said. And I'm going to protect our family. Morning came too fast. 6 riders appeared on the horizon. Sheriff Watson, Tom Garrett, Chester Morrison, and 3 deputies. Sarah was inside with the windows covered, but her frightened whimpers could be heard even outside. Eli and Miriam stood together on the porch side by side. The sheriff dismounted, holding official-looking papers. Miriam Harper, he announced loudly. By order of the Dry Creek Town Council, we are here to take custody of your daughter, Sarah Harper. You have been deemed an unfit mother due to moral character and... Miriam's legs gave out. She fell to her knees in the dirt, all her pride and dignity stripped away by raw terror. Please, she begged, tears streaming down her face. Please don't take my child. She's all I have. I didn't kill my husband. I swear I didn't. Please, I'm begging you. From inside, Sarah's scream pierced the air. Mama, Mama, don't let them take me. Morrison moved toward the door. Garrett grinned cruelly. The deputies shifted uncomfortably, but prepared to follow orders. Then Eli stepped forward, his rifle raised and ready. No one, he said quietly, his voice like iron, is taking that child. The sheriff's hand moved toward his gun. You're interfering with the law, Rollins. I'm preventing an injustice, Eli corrected. He looked at each man in turn. And I have evidence that proves it. He pulled out papers from his coat. Dr. Carson's signed testimony, Pete's statement, the store clerk's account. One by one, he presented the facts. Jacob Harper died of natural causes from years of drinking. The laudanum was his own. The debts were real, and the men who held them had motive to see him dead and his widow destroyed. Garrett and Morrison conspired to steal the Harper land. Eli said clearly. They manufactured a murder charge to destroy Miriam's reputation and seize her property cheap. This isn't justice. It's theft wrapped in lies. Morrison's face went red. That's nonsense. You have no proof. I have witnesses willing to testify in a real court, Eli interrupted. Not a rigged town council meeting. The younger deputies exchanged glances. One spoke up. Sheriff, if what he's saying is true. It's not true. Garrett snarled. In desperation, he drew his gun and pointed it at Miriam. I won't let some lying widow and her protector ruin everything. Eli's rifle cracked. The bullet hit Garrett's gun, sending it flying from his hand. Garrett screamed, clutching his injured fingers. Sheriff, Eli said calmly, his rifle now pointed at Morrison, I suggest you arrest these men for conspiracy, fraud, and attempted murder. Or I will. Sheriff Watson looked at his deputies, at the evidence, at the truth he could no longer ignore. Slowly, he nodded. Tom Garrett, Chester Morrison, you're under arrest. Sarah burst from the house and threw herself into Miriam's arms. They clung to each other, sobbing with relief. Eli stood guard until the arrested men were taken away, his rifle never wavering. The trials came swiftly. Within days, Garrett and Morrison stood before the judge, their conspiracy laid bare. The courtroom packed with townspeople who'd once whispered poison and murder now sat in stunned silence as witness after witness dismantled the lies. Dr. Carson's voice cracked with guilt as he testified about Jacob's destroyed liver, the natural death he'd been paid to hide. Pete described the gambling debts and threats. The store clerk produced receipts showing Jacob bought his own laudanum, self-medicating for pain no doctor could ease. When the judge's gavel fell, Garrett and Morrison were convicted. Miriam Harper was declared innocent of all accusations. She stood in that courthouse with Eli beside her and Sarah clutching both their hands. And for the first time in 2 years, she wept freely, not from grief, but relief so profound it shook her entire body. Back at the ranch, Miriam could have returned to her old farm, rebuilt what the storm destroyed. But too many ghosts lived in those walls. "I don't want to go back," she told Eli one evening as they sat on his porch. "I want this. I want us." Eli knelt before her. No ring, just calloused hands that had planted her seeds and rebuilt her life. "Miriam Harper, will you marry me? Let me be Sarah's father. Build this life with me." She pulled him up, kissed him hard. "Yes, to all of it. Yes." Sarah cheered so loud the horses stirred in their stalls. The wedding was simple. Doc Hastings officiated under open sky, while Pete and a handful of decent townspeople bore witness. Sarah scattered wildflowers, beaming with joy Miriam had feared she'd never see again. Eli wore his cleanest shirt. Miriam borrowed a dress. Neither had ever looked more beautiful. "I promise to stand with you, protect you, love you," Eli vowed. "I promise to trust you, honor you, build with you," Miriam answered. Sarah stood between them as they kissed, and the family was sealed. Months passed like dreams. The ranch thrived under their shared care. Miriam's garden exploded with abundance. Sarah learned to read, helped with animals, and laughed freely. No longer the solemn, wary child who'd asked if Eli was good or bad. One evening, a letter arrived from her teacher. "Sarah has blossomed. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." Miriam cried happy tears while Eli held her. "We're all going to be okay," he whispered. Even Dry Creek slowly changed. Neighbors who'd once crossed the street began nodding greetings. Some former enemies softened. Eli's courage had inspired something quiet but powerful. A year after the trials, Tom Garrett appeared at the ranch boundary, released from prison, broken and gray. Eli grabbed his rifle. Miriam pulled Sarah behind her. But Garrett raised empty hands. "I ain't here for trouble, Rollins. Just came to say I was wrong. About her. About everything." He didn't ask forgiveness. He knew better. As he turned to leave, Miriam called out, "Mr. Garrett, I forgive you." His shoulders shook. He left quietly. "You didn't have to do that," Eli said. "Yes, I did. For me, not him. I'm done carrying hate." Evening fell on the ranch. Their ranch now, legally and truly. Miriam sat on the porch with her hand resting on her growing belly, their second child stirring within. Sarah read aloud from her new book while Eli's arm wrapped around his wife's shoulders. "Do you ever think about that day in the store?" Miriam asked. "Every day. Best decision I ever made. You saved us. We saved each other," Eli corrected gently. "That's how family works." Sarah looked up from her book. "Papa Eli?" She'd called him that for months now, and it still made his chest tight. "Yes, sweetheart. Remember when I asked if you were a good man or a bad man?" "I remember. I know now." She smiled. "You're the best man." Eli's eyes filled. He pulled Sarah into his arms, and Miriam joined them. 3 becoming 4, broken pieces forming something whole. Sometimes the quietest voice carries the most power. Sometimes standing alone builds community. And sometimes the most broken people create the strongest families. Together, through every storm yet to come, they would stand. Because that's what family does.